Horror Mayhem 2025, Decades of Dread, continues. Hello, welcome to my channel, Another Bibliophile Reads. My name is Greg, and I am a co-host for Horror Mayhem 2025, Decades of Dread. This event was originally created 3 years ago by Scott and Becky Bryant to encourage people to read short horror fiction or short horror novels under 250 pages in length. Unfortunately, Scott passed on last year, but his wife Becky and all of us co-hosts are continuing this event in his memory because we want everyone to read short horror fiction. I will list all my other fabulous co-hosts in the description of this video because together we're reading a lot of great horror stories. My project for this year is to read a horror short story for every decade from 1850 to the 2020s. This video is mostly vlog style because I am reading a short story every day, or mostly every day. I do take some days off and then record my thoughts on that story on the same day that I read it. The Judge's House by Bram Stoker, originally published in 1891. This is a few years before he wrote Dracula, which was published in 1997. This is the story of a mathematics student who has to do some serious studying. So he wants a secluded place to rent where he can just immerse himself in his books. So he travels outside the city and finds an old house for rent. It has been unoccupied for many years, and the owner is willing to give it to him really cheap because he wants people to start renting this place again. Now, he is a mathematics student, the main character of this story, named Malcolmson, and he doesn't care about why it's cheap. He just wants a cheap house. He soon comes to learn that it is known as the Judge's House. There was a judge some time ago. It doesn't specify exactly how long, but maybe 100 years or so. And this judge had a very rancorous reputation. He liked to hang people. And of course, this man goes into this house. They say there's lots of bogies or boogies. I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced. But some people say these boogies or bogies are just rats. And the student doesn't really care too much about the rats in the house until he starts seeing these rats. There is one big rat with malevolent eyes that is tormenting him at night. He can hear the rats in the ceilings, and this big rat likes to torment him. And he tries to kill the rat with a poker, but is not very successful. And from there, it goes on to get a little worse. There is a large rope hanging from a ceiling known as the alarm rope to ring alarms in case there's any trouble. So what happens in this judge's house? Well, I kind of know where the story was going, not having read it, but it is a good indication of how Bram Stoker would come to be such a great writer of Dracula. It is perhaps not a ghost story, or perhaps it is a ghost story. I like it when there's some ambiguity in my stories. I am here on the blustery shores of Lake Mooney. I have read The Willows by Algernon Blackwood, originally published in 1907. This is an exceedingly famous short story. It is about two men on a canoe trip down the Danube. At this point, the Danube was relatively wilderness, and the first part of this story reads like a nature story of men on a canoe trip. But the narrator is noticing something that's just not quite normal. They are so remote, and there are a lot of these willow trees are willow bushes. And there's something just not right about the willows. And as their trip gets along further, odder things start happening. The narrator starts mentioning that at one point on this area, on the Danube, he thought the Romans worshipped the ancient gods, the gods of yore, that are no longer worshipped. And as the story progresses, it just gets creepier and creepier and creepier. But all he is he's talking about the remoteness and the willows and the things that might have been. And eventually this story will turn into a great cosmic horror story. I'm sure it had a very profound a profound effect on H.P. Lovecraft. It is that powerful. And as I was reading it at night, I just kept imagining myself in this remote location, thinking, are the willows after me? And you have to ask yourself, can a willow be terrifying? Yes, a willow can be terrifying. In the right hands of the right author, with the right atmosphere and the right mood, any kind of thing can be a horror story, which is what makes the Willows so effective, because it's a canoe trip in the wilderness. And we all know there are not dangerous things in the wilderness. There are no such things as elder gods no longer worshipped, or cosmic horrors creeping around the willows. I really liked this story. It deserves to be one of the classics in the horror genre. I don't think Lake Mooney is anything like the Danube would have been in the early parts of the 20th century, but since the story was set in a remote wilderness, I decided, why not film something in as close to a remote wilderness as I can get here in my section of Virginia. So, lo and behold, Lake Mooney. The Spider by Heinz Ewers, originally published in 1915. Although not explicitly stated in my digital copy, I do believe this story was translated from the German. Ewers was known as an actor, poet, philosopher, and writer of short stories and novels. He was in the Weimar Republic, and he got enchanted by the Nazi Party early on, although he was not anti-Semitic himself. His works were eventually banned in Germany, and all his assets were seized. He died in 1943. I had never heard of this author before, and I did a little bit of research, and I want to find some of his older novels. They are a little pricey, unfortunately, and do not exist in the Kindle editions. But this story, The Spider, is about a boarding house in Paris, and 3 people have committed suicide in 3 weeks, and they were all men. So the police are investigating. They hire a young medical student to live in this room and see if something unusual is happening in there. And of course, this young student is absolutely delighted to be living in this room by himself, because the boarding house has now been cleared of all other guests. And one day, looking out the window of his room, he sees a woman across the way spinning in her room. Now, all the other suicides have been men. And when these men are taken down from the window, they have all hung themselves with the curtain cord in front of this window. So this young man becomes fascinated with this young woman across the way, even though he never exchanges a word with her. And oh yes, there is one strange story element that does not come out right away. All these dead men have spiders, or a spider, in their mouth when they are found dead. So what is going to happen to this young medical student? Well, this story is told mostly in diary form, and you can just see the madness creeping in. Because usually it starts off, he's very explicit, very detailed, very sane. And slowly, his entries get shorter and more mad as he becomes more and more fascinated with this woman across the way. And then he sees a spider in the garden, and he notices that the spider is a female. How does he know? I'm not quite sure. But then a male approaches the web to mate with the woman. And of course, the male mates with the woman spider, and then the female spider traps the male. She bites him, fills him full of poison, wraps him up in her web, and kicks her out of her home. Well, you can tell where that allegory is going to go. This is fairly effective short story. Weird Tales. 32 Unearthed Terrors, a story from each year of the classic horror and fantasy magazine, was published. This is actually a pretty good anthology of some lesser-known horror tales from the magazine Weird Tales. I think I picked up this anthology at a Borders or a Barnes & Noble remainder sale, so it probably cost me about $2.99. Probably picked it up in the 90s. I like this anthology. The story I read was Evolution Island by Edmond Hamilton, originally published in 1927. This is sort of a mixture of science fiction and horror. It starts off with a scientist talking about a new discovery, something called a Gardner ray. And if you place a Gardner ray in front of a living item, it will start to evolve very, very quickly. You can see what a creature will look like over thousands or millions of years in a short amount of time. And of course, they have to experiment. They first show it done with chickens, and the chicken evolves to a very small, tiny creature. And then they reverse the Gardner ray and show what the chicken was like, or what it evolved from. And what was really curious is the chicken evolved into something that very much resembled a reptilian dinosaur, or what people thought dinosaurs were back then. People once thought dinosaurs were reptiles, but the chicken became a dinosaur. Pretty impressive for 1927. Well, of course, everyone kind of doesn't want this to happen, so the scientists decide to build a very big ray generator and point it out an abandoned island. Now, on this abandoned island, there are plants and some small animals, but they bring things like tigers and dogs and cats and see what they will evolve into. And of course, they evolve everything very far into the future. And all these animals eventually evolve into something that dies out, until there is something that doesn't die out. And then it becomes really rather creepy. And one of the scientists says, I'm out of here. We should not be doing this. But the other scientist says, no, we'll reverse the evolution in just a few days. Can you guess what's going to happen to that scientist? Pretty obvious from the beginning, but this is an amusing science fiction horror story from way back in the past. I liked it a lot. Not a classic, but pretty good. The Isle of the Torturers by Clark Ashton Smith, originally published in Weird Tales in 1933. Clark Ashton Smith was a critically acclaimed West Coast poet before turning to write macabre tales. This is a cross between fantasy and horror, and part of his Xanadu series of tales. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correct. Well, there is a king in this fantasy kingdom, but his land is being struck by a silver death plague that can strike people almost immediately. You freeze up and turn a pallid color of white and become stiff as a corpse, and then you die. Well, this king is stricken by this silver death plague, but one of his sorcerers gives him a magic ring that will prevent the onslaught of the plague, because this plague is highly contagious. And the king flees his land. The king ends up on an island inhabited by a king and its residents that love to torture people to death. If you are a shipwrecked sailor and land up on this island, you will come to no good end. And the king sees his fellow shipmates tortured to death. But they're saving this king for something special, a very long and drawn out torture. And the king says, of this island says to the other king, tomorrow your torture will begin. And in the middle of the night, a beautiful young woman sneaks into his prison cell and says, I will protect you. I love you. Just endure one day of torture, and after that, I will rescue you. Well, he endures his torture for one day, and the beautiful woman comes back and says, my plan has failed. Endure one more day of torture, and tomorrow I will certainly rescue you. Well, that is the setup for this story. It is a rather curious story. It is horrific in a way, and it is also a fantasy story. There is the magic of this strange land, there is the silver death, and there is, of course, the Isle of the Torturers. It was decent. I'm not going to say it's a great story, but it's decent. Okay, those are the stories that I read this week. The clear winner for this week is The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. I'm guessing that The Isle of the Torturers by Clark Ashton Smith was the weakest entry, but even at the weakest entry, it was still decent. Thank you for watching, and keep on reading short horror fiction.